All right, welcome back to part two of the Buckhaven Land Solutions Alabama Wildlife Habitat Restoration Project. This is our um, upland oak and hickory woodland restoration video. As you can see here, this is our pre-commercial timber harvest conditions. It's a mixed pine and hardwood forest with a pretty much closed canopy overstory, well-developed mid-story, uh, pretty much shading out any herbaceous understory that would develop within this stand. Um, we'll explain in just a second some of the things we did to convert this back to a more historically accurate setting of a upland oak hickory woodland that has a herbaceous understory component, as well as retaining a lot of the beneficial mass producing hardwood species for the wildlife. All right, so this stand we're in now is our oak woodland, and what we did in this stand was come in with a commercial timber harvest and reduce the basal area to about 70 to 80. And what that's going to do is reduce the crowding in amongst these white oaks and red oaks to allow them to expand their canopy for greater acorn production, as well as get more sunlight on the ground to promote a better herbaceous understory component for cover and forage for wildlife. Um, we have not yet implemented prescribed fire in the stand. We're going to do that same as our thinner basal area plantation cut. We're going to do that late this dormant season, this upcoming 2023, early 2023, end of 2022 dormant season. As you can see, we've already got a pretty decent response from some various forbs and hardwood sprouts in here, especially in areas that had more bare ground exposed, and some areas where there's still pretty thick leaf litter. We haven't had that response, but when we implement that prescribed fire, remove that leaf litter, that's going to open up that soil for the seed bank to have an excellent response and promote that understory that we're looking for within this stand. This stand is probably going to be managed on a slightly longer fire return interval, since we're going to have a little bit less sunlight getting in this stand, and we are working with upland oaks. We may extend that fire interval out to 4 to 5 years depending on the vegetation response, but we'll just have to play that by ear and see what the vegetation is giving us based on the amount of sunlight and rain. One awesome thing that I have been noticing walking through these stands after this timber cut is seeing the amount of insects, especially butterflies and other pollinators, and hearing the amount of songbirds that's in here that until we opened this canopy up, we never saw any pollinating insects or heard very many songbirds. So that is a awesome indicator that we are moving in the right direction in these stands. All right, so here is the post timber harvest example. This right here is where our more open lower basal area plantation cut, more savanna type area merges into our slightly higher basal area cut upland oak woodland. You'll see the camera pan here in just a second and show you that transition zone. But that's one thing we really wanted to do in this this habitat restoration project, was have different various types of habitat, creating transition zones merging together in different locations. I want to take a minute to explain why we decided to implement some of the different objectives and some of the different places that we did specifically on the property. And the main goal for this project was to try to mimic the way this area would have looked 200 years ago, before European settlement. This property is in eastern Alabama, where the Ridge and Valley and the Piedmont come together. So most of the area is rolling hills that intersect with steep slopes, with flat ridge tops, and then back down the other side into more rolling hills. And then your river basins were flat bottomland and basically straight back into rolling hills. And the biggest disturbance that occurred in these areas to drive the plant communities was fire. And whether it was set unintentionally or intentionally by Native Americans or by natural processes such as lightning strikes, fire and the intensity at which that fire burned drove the plant communities. For example, south and west facing slopes are very dry. They get a lot more sunlight to help evaporate that moisture, and they're really conducive to hot, fast-moving fires. And so the trees that would live on that site would only be the most fire-adapted species. And in this area, it was predominantly longleaf pine, shortleaf pine, and some of your more fire-adapted oaks, blackjack oak, post oak, southern red oak, and they would be very sparsely scattered on these south and west slopes, creating a more open savanna type landscape with a very herbaceous understory of native grasses and forbs. Fire returned to these sites pretty frequently because of how readily they burned. As fire would rush up and burn really hot up the south facing slopes and across the ridge tops, oftentimes forming like a glade on the ridge top, the fire would back more slowly down the north facing slopes that tend to get less sunlight and tend to be a little bit wetter, hold a little bit more moisture. On these northern facing slopes, you'd start to get species that were maybe not quite as fire adaptive as some of the ones we mentioned on the south facing slopes, but still relatively resistant to fire, such as some of your hickory species, your standard white oak, and some other various white oak and red oak species. As you progressed down and got more into the creek bottoms or river bottoms, that's where you started to have some of your species that are not adapted to fire at all. Red maple, yellow poplar, sweet gum, species that really cannot take a lot of heat. When fires would rush up those south facing slopes, cross ridge tops, burn less severely down the north facing slopes, when they'd hit a really wet creek bottom, the fire would either just burn around that in the uplands and continue to spread, or it would just go out. And we wanted to replicate that mosaic on this property. So on all the south facing slopes, we cut the basal area back a little bit lower, and we're going to eventually replicate that more severe fire intensity on these sites. But because fire has been excluded for so long in these areas, sorry, the wind tried to blow the camera off, so excuse the pause, but because fire burns more severely in the south-facing slopes, we've excluded fire. Fire has been excluded from this particular site for a long time. So the first couple of fires are going to be lower intensity so we don't do damage to the trees. But that's what drove our species selection when doing the timber harvest. We tried to leave predominantly various species of pines. We left loblolly on there for aesthetics because we didn't want it to look clear cut. But we left a lot of shortleaf pine where we could find it. We left some species of oaks such as southern red oak, blackjack, and post oak. On the north facing slopes, we left your standard white oak, various hickory species, again more southern red oak if it was there, few post oaks if they were there, but the predominant species that we left on the north facing slopes were just your standard white oak and various hickory species. In the bottomlands, again, we left more of your bottomland species, yellow poplar, sweet gum, few bottomland oak species such as swamp chestnut oak, but the historic disturbance regime and the way this property would have looked hundreds of years ago is what drove our decision to cut different areas different ways. Alright, so that's the end of part 2 in our oak hickory woodland. Hope you guys learned something from this video. If you have any questions, feel free to call us or look us up at buckhavenlandsolutions.com. Stay tuned for part 3. And again, always make sure to let creation point you to the Creator. God in heaven loves you. He wants to have a relationship with you. If you have any questions about that as well, that's what I'd really like to talk to you about. So stay tuned for part 3, and hope you guys like our videos.